Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's Pulse Advisor webinar. Really pleased to say that once again, we're joined by the guys at QB Partners. So we have Mike Foxall, who'll be doing the bulk of the presentation today, and he's joined by his colleague, Dave White, who'll join in at the Q&A at the end. Certainly really pleased that we could get this session shoehorned in between now and the end of the year, because a lot of advisor traffic and questions recently has been on the UK budget that was announced recently, and certainly changes to QROPs, changes to potential inheritance tax on inherited pensions in the future, and of course a move confirmed from a domicile to a residency-based regime when looking at inheritance tax liabilities in the future. So with all of that, it's potentially impacting not only planning you've already put in place, but planning you are looking to put in place with your clients moving forwards. So a lot to talk through this morning. That's enough from me. I'll hand over to Mike and Dave now, and of course, pose your questions as we go along, and we'll cover those once the session's over in about 35 minutes time. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody. It's a bit chilly where I am, but obviously, depending where you are in the world, it's probably a bit different. Just a quick reminder of who QB Partners are. We're actually 15 years old this year. Don't send flowers, but obviously quality bottles of red wine sent to our address in the Isle of Man are always appreciated. We are fully independent, technical support unit, and we basically cover international pensions, cross-border trusts and estate planning, wealth insurance and business protection. You can access us to a degree through Novia Global. Obviously, if you ask too many questions too often, they'll probably send you directly to us instead. But please do come and ask us anything that you need help with on the technical side. So today is really about the fallout from the autumn budget. So a little bit of sort of background. July the 4th, Labour won 411 of 650 seats. It's generally known as a parliamentary landslide. But they then delayed their first budget, the first one since 2010, right through until the end of October. Rachel Reeves stood on her feet for just over an hour and 20 minutes. And not all the measures that we will present and talk about today were actually mentioned in the speech. So, some of you with long memories will recall that actually there was also a spring budget in 2024. And that kicked off a number of the things that were then reinforced and confirmed in the autumn budget on the 30th of October. So the end of remittance basis of income and gains for UK res non-doms, that will cease from 6th of April 2025. That will be replaced with a new 4-year foreign income and gains regime. And that was confirmed. For res non-doms, that's clearly a downgrade. But actually for UK expats who may want to come back to the UK, there's something in there that could be very useful in future planning. There will be a move to a residence-based IHT system instead of domicile, and that has also been confirmed, along with on excluded property trusts, they will be subject to periodic and exit IHT charges from April 25. But there were a few surprises. Now, the first one on the far right there, unused pension funds would fall into and be subject to UK IHT on the death of the pension member. We actually did have a little of a heads up on that. The Institute of Fiscal Studies had actually suggested this as an idea. And certainly QB Partners had touted that into the industry on a couple of occasions in the run-up to the budget. However, the one in the middle in blue there, UK EA and Gibraltar exemption removed from the QROP's 25% overseas transfer charge. That came completely from left field, and no one, I think, saw that coming at all. So what does that mean? A month down the line, just over a month down the line, what does all this begin to translate into? Well, just some reminders. The overseas transfer charge changed actually that day on 30th of October, And those exemptions for EEA, being the main one, and Gibraltar, have been removed. There is a transitional period, so if you've got transfers actually in process and have been initiated by the 30th of October, it's important that they are completed by 30th of April 2025. The other exemptions, for example, if you're in the same country as the receiving QROPS, we worked out there's probably 3 or 4 of those within the European context. Obviously, Australia and other countries further afield, that definitely works still. And then an update, there was a question asked several times after the budget, if you relocate within 5 years of making the transfer, is that going to trigger, so from one European country, say, to another, would that trigger an overseas transfer charge? That has now been confirmed that that won't happen, as long as you stay within the EEA. Obviously, if you've got a multi-QROPS and you're in France and you move to further afield, then that will still, within the 5 years, create an overseas transfer charge. The last bit in brackets, not sure on the UK. So if you've got a multi-QROPS, you're living in France or Spain, and you decide you don't like it, you're going to go back to the UK. At the moment, it is not 100% clear what the outcome would be there. And then as far as regulatory changes for overseas pensions and ROPs, the crucial thing here is that they're insisting you've got to be regulated in specific country. And if you think about it, for say a multi-provider to try and recreate QROPS all over the EU, that becomes extremely difficult. Little note on the right there, apparently the logic of getting rid of those exemptions was primarily around this idea that you could have $1 million in a UK pension, $1 million in a QROPS, and effectively end up with 2 lots of the 25% tax-free cash. Effectively, the double bubble that was announced as a planning idea in the Telegraph back in the middle of the year. So that's what the problem they were trying to resolve and stop. And of course, they've come along and also hit EEA and Gibraltar as well. So some key outcomes. Well, the benefits for an EEA resident transferring to QROPS have effectively been removed, except if you are in the same country, which really leaves the international SIP, which of course is UK situs. So that has different implications and outcomes further down the line. For non-LTRs, a transfer for an existing QROPS to a SIP wouldn't generally be recommended. Okay, this is specifically for non-LTRs, i.e. people that will have been outside the UK for over 10 years. Because if you are non-UK tax res for greater than 10 years, plus you've been 5 years since you've transferred, then the UK pension rules are no longer applicable. Okay, that's always was the case. But also from April 2025, as a non-long-term resident, the underlying assets should not be subject to UK IHT. Clearly, for other QROPS to SIP cases, you're just going to have to look at those case by case on their own merits. Regarding autumn budget and some plays on the inheritance tax side of things, again, slide just sort of giving us the core facts. Nil rate thresholds remain unchanged until April 2030. So you've got your 1 million as a couple using also the property allowance. Obviously 40% anything above that. Again, quite a sizable change around business property relief and agricultural property relief. They now have a combined cap of 1 million. If anybody's got a number of trusts that were set up before the 30th of October, it is possible to have a million nil rate band on those APRs and PPRs per trust. You can't then create that situation in the post-October world because it will be combined across all the trusts. Where you exceed the 1 million, then the IHT is effectively, you get 50% relief, so you've effectively got a 20% tax rate. And of course, those AIM shares that people have used for sort of BPR relief against IHT traditionally, that they're hit with the 20% across the whole piece. There's no 1 million sort of nil rate piece there. It does mean that proper asset-backed investments rather than the AIM shares, they would still qualify for that million relief. So again, they tend to be risky investments, but if it's an area that you do get involved in, then that's something to explore further. And then with regarding UK pension funds, so they are going to be subject to IHT on death. There's a 12-week consultation which will run until the 22nd of January. They're saying that's admin only, but I think what we've got to quite quickly is government is really looking for guidance, knowledge, input to try and work out how they're actually going to do this. It does mean that unused funds on death will be treated as part of the deceased estate, and that's uncrystallised funds as well as funds that are already in a drawdown synopsis. Will apply to UK registered schemes and qualifying non-UK schemes. Okay, also both a defined contribution and defined benefit. Question mark. Still haven't had an answer on that. Small number of exemptions. So dependent scheme pension, always gifts to charities. We know they fall out of UK IHT anyway, and the spousal exemption. And I think the spousal exemption could be become very important to some of the planning going forward. Regarding non-DOMs, which in a few months we won't be using the term non-DOMs, it will be non-long-term residents. So domicile and non-domicile will be replaced by this long-term resident status. And if you're a resident in the UK for at least 10 of the last 20 years, then you will be treated and called long-term resident. That will mean that from April 2025, you will be liable to UK IHT on your worldwide assets. If a long-term resident becomes non-resident, then the liability to UK IHT on your worldwide assets will stay in scope for 3 years if your residence was between 10 and 13 years. You then add a year for each year of residence, up to a maximum of 10 years of a tail where you're still caught by worldwide IHT on worldwide assets, where you've had 10 years of the previous 20 years as UK resident. So if you were UK resident 15 years, your tail is 5 years. The test is fully reset if the individual returns to the UK in the year following 10 consecutive years of non-residence. And not only is that reset, then in the new regime of foreign income gains, it should be the situation where for the first 4 years, you can generate income and gains outside the UK and they won't be attract to UK tax. It really does open up some quite strange and different planning opportunities going forward. This is all going to be based on the UK statutory resident test. I think it's going to be important for advisors to better understand the functionality of that. It is quite a complex piece of UK legislation, but at least it does have clear outcomes, which before it was brought in was often a very confusing area of advice. I always find this one quite interesting. If somebody's under 21 years of age, the test will be whether you're treated as long-term resident UK, will be based on whether you've had 50% of tax years since your birth in the UK. So you can imagine a 7-year-old who's been living in the UK for 4 years. They are now long-term tax resident in the UK, but their parents, who've only been living in the UK for 4 years, won't be long-term tax residents for at least another 6 years. Strange outcomes from a strange piece of legislation, I suppose. Formally, domiciled resident rules will be irrelevant. So the spouse election, the election to become domiciled because of potentially IHT benefits, getting a full spousal exemption rather than being restricted to 325 as the nil rate band, you can now elect, instead of to be domiciled, to become long-term resident. And remember that long-standing UK expats will all become ex-long-term residents on 6th of April 2025. I will be one of those because I've lived in Republic of Ireland now for over 11 years. Regarding relevant settled property around trust planning, typically discretionary trusts, classes of where you've got layers, classes of beneficiaries, or a trust with a succession of interests, you will have an entry charge. This has always been the case for UK domiciles, 20% initial, with a further 20% if the settler dies within 7 years, anything over the 325 nil rate band. Of course, if you're not long-term resident when you put assets into such a trust, then there isn't the 20% initial charge. However, from next April, all such trusts, discretionary trusts, including the ones that were traditionally called excluded property trust, fall into UK IHT in that they are relevant settled property, and therefore the periodic charge, which is up to 6% on the value of the trust every 10 years, will apply. And if you take money out between those 10-year periods, then the exit charge, which is a proportion of the 6%, will apply. So typically, if you have paid your periodic charge at 10 years, you can take some money out after, say, 15 years. You're halfway between the two periodic charge points, you're going to get hit for a 3% charge, give or take. So what does that mean regards planning? What are the things we need to start thinking about? Well, I think there are some initial outcomes. There is a need, absolute need, for more UK IHT planning, client reviews of what, the advice they've had in the past and what needs to change. How does it now fit with what their long-term and short-term plans are? Hopefully you've all written to Rachel Reeves to thank her for this. I actually felt obliged to send flowers and chocolates as well, because this is just for advice. This is fantastic. It's going to keep us in a job for another 10 to 15 years. You're going to have to focus on the client's resident status. Again, I would advocate you educate yourselves a little bit more around the statutory residence test. It is complicated. You don't need to know the full ins and outs of it, but I think getting a good, solid overview is going to be important. Expats who live overseas long term without acquiring a new domicile of choice. Most of you have probably been down that road with a number of clients in the past. It was a nightmare trying to work out how you got rid of your UK domicile of origin. It was hard work, and God, if you then moved again, it all came back, and it was lots of tax advice, very expensive process, etc., and a long process often. That's removed. We've now got this very simple, it's 10 years, not 10 years, it's cut and dried. However, existing relevant settlement property, these discretionary trusts I mentioned in the previous page, an exit charge can be triggered by a long-term resident leaving the UK, or crucially, somebody that's already 10 years outside the UK on 6th of April next year. And that's not going to be applicable just to people who were previously res non-doms with excluded property trust. So myself, who was always a UK domicile of origin, now outside the UK, if I'm connected to a UK discretionary offshore discretionary trust, that should trigger an exit charge for me next April. I think there's an awful lot of people out there that will be completely unaware of this, and they will need advice to help them walk through that. And of course, the bottom one there, the removal of the EEA and GIB CUROPS exemption pretty much restricts for cross-border planning around Europe. I think it effectively kills the CUROPS going forward, but we'll point out at the end, there's still some use for CUROPS. So some planning points, a full review funding of UK pensions, UK connected pensions. We've tended to think about them as long-term IHT vehicles where people have perhaps got other assets that can generate their income in retirement. Well, now you've got to flip that over. Maybe now the pension becomes the thing that feeds the income to fund the retirement. And there's other assets that can be put into certain structures that may be more efficient. So for UK clients, for example, is there a resurgence around things like discounted gift trusts and loan trusts in connection to offshore bonds? All of that needs to be put into the mix. These changes remove the IHT incentive to retain wealth in both UK pension schemes and overseas qualifying pension schemes. But the retention of UK pension freedoms means that it really can open up other avenues of planning. But of course, you have to be very aware of the tax residency of the client. So as a very quick example, if somebody's in Portugal, maybe under the old NHR, keeping their pension, taking a little bit of income from it because it gave them a defense against UK IHT. Well, potentially that's going to disappear. So do you now plan in a different way and just strip the pension as much as you can, yes, you're paying either 0 or 10% on the income tax in Portugal, but then do you get it into a Portuguese compliant policy sooner? And therefore you create the 8-year ticking clock, which brings down your tax on that structure. That's the sort of planning that's going to have to be looked at and considered. There is, of course, a full UK IHT spousal exemption, which will apply to the pension as it applies to other assets. But of course, it does not apply when you've got a UK long-term residence linked with a UK non-long-term resident spouse. That's the one it fails on. So as we said earlier, you can elect to become LTR, but what are the wider implications of that further down the line? Review pension beneficiary nominations. Do you now use the spousal exemption? Do you need to consider maybe a pre and post April 2027 expression of wish? Possibly, because pre, you have your children beneficiaries. Post, you might then have them having a small part, maybe linked to the nil rate ban, but the rest is then a spousal exemption. We think IOPS will remain unlikely alternatives to QROPS, primarily because it does have to be a genuine company scheme. And for most clients, retiring into Europe, etc., that's going to be very difficult to set up and prove. Some more key planning points. Consider the impact on couples with different domiciles, because just because they've got different domiciles does not mean they'll have different LTR status, or vice versa. So again, this change from domicile to long-term residence has different implications, and it won't always balance out exactly. Review all UK expatriates with any connection to a trust. As I said, if I've got a connection to a discretionary trust, next April, I'll be hit by an exit charge, a periodic exit charge on a relevant settled trust structure. You should anyway always be considering or talking to any expat in France if they've got any connection to a trust. And if you have clients in that situation, do please come and contact us and chat about it, because there's some serious implications in France with even a vague, grandson living in Paris whose grandfather set up a trust many years ago and they're a discretionary beneficiary. That alone can bring it within the French tax rules, and they're not pleasant for trusts. Consider how UK IHT on pensions interact with the lump sum death benefit, the income tax charge for each beneficiary. Logically, if you're going to get hit for 40% IHT on what you leave to a beneficiary, and that beneficiary is, say, a 45% taxpayer in the UK, you're upwards of 65, 70% of tax here. There's some serious implications that we need to look at solutions to get around. For a couple of points on the last two are really UK planning ideas and thoughts. Existing excluded property trusts for res non-doms there. Do they consider making distributions pre-next April? And of course, those trusts will also lose the trust protections that came in 2017, which basically protected against UK income tax and capital gains as they arise. Well, they will now be open to those taxes, and therefore does an international insurance policy which can deliver genuine tax deferral and has that 5% tax efficient income into the UK. That could be something that's very useful in that plan. And then one of our colleagues came up with this little sweet idea, UK gilts. So they are not UK IHTable. So if you spend a single year as a non-resident, you could invest into UK gilts. He thinks best you don't even trip home for a holiday or for Christmas. You then transfer the assets to children. They can still be UK residents. They can sell the following tax year. There's zero IHT and there's zero capital gains tax on those gilts. Possibly, if depending what type of gilt is creating an income, there could be some income tax that they may have had to pay. But as a one-off to take a lump out of somebody, for very wealthy clients, take a lump out, that may be something worth considering. Then some knowns, and there's a lot of half knowns, lots of unknowns that we're in the situation since October. But from April 2025, any UK long-term spouse making a transfer to a non-long-term spouse, that will definitely limit the spouse exemption to the nil rate ban. that can be resolved, as I said, by electing to become long-term resident. Some of you will remember Gordon Brown introduced legislation that declared UK OICs and unit trusts as excluded property if held by a non-dom. The draft legislation confirms that those items constituting, sorry, I'll put my teeth in, excluded property shall remain the same. But in terms of ownership, non-dom is simply replaced by this long-term resident position. So from April 2025, non-long-term residents will have no UK IHT liability on non-UK situs assets, but also they're on UK situs assets which are classified as excluded property, which includes UK unit trusts and UK OICs. So that can become part of a planning investment synopsis. We've been asked this question on the back of that sort of understanding and knowledge. What about ISAs holding assets, which for non-DOMs, which obviously we will soon get rid of that term and become long-term or non-long-term residents, are deemed excluded property from IHT. So a non-long-term resident with an ISA, which only holds UK OICs and unit trusts, will it fall outside of UK IHT? We don't know the answer because it hasn't been, it's not even put into draft legislation, but we don't believe that will be the case. The ISA, with the ISA, the UK government has offered clear beneficial tax incentives, and historically that then tends to make the situs of the structure to be the tax point. So we believe at this stage that that won't remove the ISA from UK IHT under the new regime. And then the unknowns. Well, the big unknown really, and the big issue with all of this is that there's a big problem in that much of the finer detail is certainly unpublished. The suspicion is that some of it hasn't yet even been written. There is absolutely zero draft legislation and not even a technical note from either the government or HMRC in reference to this proposed IHT on pensions. Pretty much what we've got is what Rachel Reeves stood up and said on October 30th. An awful lot of what is written is, of course, still in draft format. Draft logically means that it can be changed. There is one element, a published HMRC technical note that states the UK has 10 IHT double tax conventions, i.e. those that cover estate duty, only 10. And there are no changes to the treaties or how they operate. So HMRC have confirmed that. The problem is that all of them are based on domicile. And yet, from next April, the UK domestic law will change to one of long-term residency. So quite how those double tax conventions are going to work when you're dealing with long-term and non-long-term residents, and yet they're talking about domicile, which is a completely different basis under law. So quite how that hangs together, really don't know. How will, and this is really just a thought from me, this is, please don't take this as gospel. How will HMRC claim IHT on QROPs? They're kind of dependent upon a third country provider, maybe those companies in Malta, whose incentive to be UK qualified as an overseas pension is surely linked to continued flows of new business. If that flow stops, what is that incentive? And what does that mean if they choose to be no longer qualified, both to an existing book or to their relationship with HMRC and what information they do or don't provide? Again, that's in the unknowns segment because it is an unknown along with those other issues there. So I'm just going to finish off with some very basic case studies. And really, these are pretty much all focusing on the areas that QROPs still exist, and there aren't many. So by heading there, Malta, the new Portugal. So Jeff prefers Mediterranean Europe. He thinks the cold Atlantic isn't ideal for his complexion. He has other assets he wants to burn through during his retirement, and he's always viewed his pension as something to leave the kids. So moving to Malta under the permanent residence scheme avoids tax on all CGT, even if remitted, and you'll get any remitted income, you'll get hit with 15%, reduced tax to 15%. He does have to pay a minimum each year, 4,230. He doesn't have to own a property there. He can rent something. He does have to turn up a few days a year, put his bins out, and so on. But he doesn't actually have to spend a huge amount of time there. So somebody who wants to be a little nomadic around Europe could be a great base. And some of you may have clients who feel that way. Of course, he can transfer to a multi-currency. There's no overseas transfer charge. And if he's not going to take the pension income and he's going to leave it to his kids, and with the cure ops after the 10 years and 5 years, that will put him outside the UK IHT because it's a non-UK status asset, then he's not going to be hit by the progressive rates of tax in Malta up to 35%. If he does take income from his Malta cure ops, of course, because he's there, and the cure ops is there, then it is those rates of tax, not the 15% remitted income tax that he will get on his other assets outside of Malta. So that's one thought. Ireland, it's got to be the new UK. It's got to be the new UK for really wealthy resident dons. So as a wealthy UK domicile of origin, Mike discovers, this is not me, by the way, that's a different Mike, because this one's wealthy. He can claim resident don status in Ireland, so you're taxed only on remittance, okay? And his resident non-dom status will also help him avoid capital acquisition tax on his non-Irish assets. CAT is the equivalent of IHT in Ireland. So once 10 years outside the UK, UK IHT will no longer apply to his non-UK status assets. He's not going to be taxed on his non-Irish status assets. So he's got wealth, say, in a big Luxembourg offshore bond or whatever, plenty of millions in that. None of that is going to be hit for IHT going forward. He can also move his pension away from UK IHT because Ireland also offers a generally available local cure ops. And therefore, because it's local in the same country, you again avoid the 25% OTC. So generally, Ireland, for very wealthy UK individuals and resident doms who came to the UK thinking it was a good tax environment to be in, could be a place of choice going forward. I'm obviously starting a secondary business, and that will be what we'll be focused on. Isle of Man, if you love the weather of Ireland, but you want something a little bit smaller, a bit more cozy, then maybe Isle of Man is better suited. Jane is ex-UK resident, lived on Isle of Man over 10 years. She will automatically be non-UK LTR. Of course, domicile will be irrelevant from next April. Therefore, all her non-UK assets will be outside of her UK estate for IHT assessment, which is great. But also, again, like Malta before, like Ireland before, Isle of Man offers local cure ops, so she can transfer her UK pension there, avoid the 25% OTC, and be outside the UK IHT net. There is a warning there, careful, obviously 5-year member payment provision rules. That does actually keep it within the UK IHT net during those 5 years. So the transfer hasn't been made, you do it now. We've really got a ticking clock on 5 years. And then the last couple, moving to France. So Steve considers accessing his full pension under the 7.5% flat tax regime in France. Social taxes can increase that, of course, and those social taxes tend to be based on your previous years of French tax residency, how much tax you paid as a household, etc. Quite complicated. We always bring in a specialist tax advisor to help in those situations. He then reinvests in assurance fee for tax deferral, and of course that would bring in lower succession taxes within the French tax regime. Looking further afield, UAE, perhaps other low tax regimes, secure residence status, reside 1 full tax year. If over age 55, you can effectively surrender the pension at 0 tax, and then reinvest in the best vehicle for whatever country of residence you may be looking to move to in the future. And that might be an international insurance policy. Again, as I said earlier, historically, the IHT benefit, the defence against UK IHT of the pension would have often stopped this type of planning. But why would you not do this sort of thing now going forward if it's going to give you a better outcome in the country you're going to move to? If you are thinking of just doing that, then going back to the UK, forget, just be careful. You've still got that 5 years tax avoidance, non-residence tax avoidance rules. So you would have to be out for more than 5 tax years if you're going to do that planning and then go back to the UK. which brings us to the questions. And hopefully Paul and David have kept on top of those.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. A hell of a lot of information in there, so thanks for running through that very clearly. And just to reiterate, there will be a recording of this session. So if you do want to go into the finer detail and review anything at your leisure later, you'll be able to do that when we send the recording in the next 24, 48 hours. Or indeed, if you want to share the recording with any of your colleagues who you think may find it of interest. I can see there's been a couple of questions popped in as we've been running through the session there. David, have you been able to collate those?
Yeah, they're both about cure-ups actually, Paul. So I'll take the second one first, if I may, because we've just covered that. So the question is, if you transfer your pension now to a cure-ups and spend 10 years out of the UK before you die, would the cure-ups fall outside of the IHT piece, since outside member payment charges and reporting timescales? So yeah, thank you. Good question. I think Mike alluded to it in the slides and then in the case studies as well on sort of Malta, Ireland and Isle of Man. It's one of the benefits of those jurisdictions, really. So just sort of going back a step, from April 27, QNUPs and therefore cure-ups will be inside the estate for IHT purposes. So if your estate is accessible for IHT purposes, they have said that QNUPs and cure-ups will be inside the estate for IHT purposes. But the point that there's 2 points on the 10-year thing, really. One is after 10 years of non-UK residence, somebody will be deemed non-UK long-term resident. And then there is a cure-ups rule, as the questioner alludes to. Under the member payment provision periods, there is a rule of 10 years outside of the UK. The cure-ups isn't accessible for UK taxes. Mike also alluded to the 5 years from date of transfer, so you have to watch that as well. But the short answer to the question is yes, if somebody's been outside of the UK for 10 years and it's 5 years from the date of transfer, the cure-ups will be outside of the estate, because it'll be a non-UK asset. So even if the worldwide assets are still accessible, then if the worldwide assets are still accessible, then you would think it was within that. But because of the cure-ups rules, it's not deemed as within the estate. So that's that question.
Right.
Hopefully that answers that clearly. And then the second one that I've got here, if you are resident in France, for example, and have a Malta cure-ups, which was transferred post 9317, so within scope of overseas transfer charge, that was brought in 2017, wasn't paid using the EEA exemption, are still within your 5-year period, would you incur the charge if you move from one Malta cure-ups provider to another Malta cure-ups provider? And the answer there is no. We've actually asked HMRC this question directly and had a response from HMRC, and they've confirmed that you can, within the 5-year period, move from one Malta cure-ups provider to another without incurring an overseas transfer charge.
Right. I can see one of the questions there matches one which was posed to me by someone who would only take the recording. They couldn't dial in live today. We've got the spousal exemption. And previously we had the non-dom cap at 325,000. If both the spouses are deemed to be non-long-term residency, is there a cap on the spousal exemption, or is it unlimited where they are both not deemed to be long-term residents in the UK?
Do you want me to take that?
Yes, please, Mike. Thanks.
Yeah, I have got a piece on this, but basically the only combination that gets caught by the cap of nil rate band is when you've got a long-term resident in old money, that would be a domicile, and a non-long-term resident in old money, non-domicile. That's the only one that gets caught by the 325. Everything else there is no restriction, spousal restriction on the exemption between the spouses. And one of my colleagues, Scott Hood, did a really smart piece on this that explained the logic of it. And it's all down to, if you think it through, it's all down to HMRC making sure that if money is passed to somebody else, they can still grab, they can still get their tax. And that's the only one where it can go from somebody that they can tax to somebody they can't tax. And that's why it's called.
Great stuff. One of the other questions posed was, obviously there's a consultation taking place now on IHT on inherited pensions until the 22nd of January, I think it is. How do you participate if you've got something you want to contribute into that?
There is a link to that consultation which you can get hold of. Probably the best thing to do without circulating the link is just go onto the HMRC website and search for IHT consultation 2024, and I think that'll bring up a link to the actual consultation. You'll be able to contribute to that.
Right. And then the last one for me is you actually touched on it in there, saying that the UK OICs and unit trusts were deemed to be excluded property, but there is a look through if they're held within an ISA. I assume if the OIC and unit trust is held within a GIA, that would be not look through if that GIA was situated offshore.
I would think so at this stage. Again, we're still in draft legislation. We haven't got all the all the I's have not been dotted and all the T's have not been crossed in any of this. But that would make sense because even for somebody living in the UK who's non-DON or any non-LTR going forward, they are excluded property. So you'd think the GIA is it just a platform? It's just holding those assets. It's those assets that are taxable. That's the tax point through the platform. The platform isn't really a taxable point, but the assets are. But when you put structures around things like pensions, like ISAs, like offshore bonds, you move the tax point. And therefore, I think again, this isn't definitive. It's our belief at the moment that the ISA will still form part of you'll always be caught on an ISA because of the tax benefits you got from investing in it in the first place.
Right stuff.
Yeah, we think that's a little bit anomalous where there's a UK tax structure, but certainly if there's a non-UK GIA with non-UK assets underneath it, I would say that would be outside of the estate. I'd agree with that. You know what? There is a lot to be clarified, as we've said,
yep.
And the title alluded to what's clear and what isn't clear. And on the pension within IHT changes, the government have given themselves 2 years to work that out. We think there's a reason why they're not bringing them in from 6th of April 27 because they're being nice to people. They normally bring in changes that are made in the budget from this start of the next tax year, which would be 6th of April 25. There's so much within this change that needs to be worked out, particularly regarding the QNUPs and offshore pensions piece and how all of that gets reported. Some of that might come out of the consultation period, but we do think that they've just given themselves extra time to sort of work some of these things out.
Great stuff. Just working through the remaining questions. Someone's asked about the slides being made available. So, yep, there will be an email link sent within the next 48 hours to all of you who've registered. And then last question is regarding writing wills. I think you guys do have access to a will writing service. So I think that's something that you will be able to help the guys out with if they've got any queries specific to will writing.
Yeah, so Scott Hood, who has been on some of these webinars, one of our colleagues, is a qualified will writer in England and Wales, and he's a member of the Society of Will Writers for England and Wales. So Scott's able to offer support with writing wills. And then he manages for us a panel of will writers in other jurisdictions as well. So we're able to offer support with wills in other jurisdictions. He doesn't believe in the concept of an international will. He believes that if somebody has assets in a number of different jurisdictions, you should have a will in each jurisdiction. And certainly, to the question, there will be implications in writing wills in all of this. All of these changes will have to be taken into account when writing a will, and there's the responsibility of the person writing the will to sort of point out to the individual whose will it is that if they're writing something within the will which is going to give them an unnecessary tax charge, or a tax charge which could be planned around, I'll say, rather than avoided, then I think there's a responsibility within the will writer to point that out. And the will writer, may not be a qualified financial planner, may or may not be. So yeah, we can certainly help with both the financial planning aspects and the will writing aspects, and where they interact.
Great stuff. Well, looking at it, I think that's wrapped up all the questions. So a big thank you to everyone who's tuned in today. And of course, a big thanks to Mike and Dave for their input on the session today. This is quite a moving feast, so watch this space as things change and the legislation starts to become clearer and things become implemented. We will keep you updated. As I say, there will be a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording sent out to everybody very shortly. And with this being the last session of 2024, hopefully it's not too soon to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. A big thank you for all your support with the webinars this year, and look forward to seeing you in the new year. So with that, we'll wrap things up for today. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.